The hum of the airplane engines was a steady, almost comforting background to the tension building in the cramped cabin. Jamal sat by the window, his face pressed against the cold glass as he watched the world below shrink into a blur of clouds. It was a short flight, just a few hours from Atlanta to New York, but it felt like an eternity. He had been on many flights before, but this one felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched, of being judged. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers as they moved about, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their gaze lingering on him for just a moment too long. He could feel it in the small, subtle things, the slight shift of a head when he walked past, the hesitant way the flight attendant handed him his drink, as though she feared he might refuse it or make a scene. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are listening. Your support means everything. It wasn't new. Jamal had lived with this for as long as he could remember. He'd grown used to it, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. It didn't mean the sting of racism, even in its smallest forms, didn't cut just as deeply. At 22, Jamal had learned to navigate the world through the lens of both his ambition and his skin. He was going to visit his sister in New York, a brief escape from the weight of being constantly labeled. He hoped the flight would be smooth, the conversation with his sister light and easy. But as he settled into his seat, his body stiffened as something was off. His senses heightened, and the pit in his stomach grew larger. He glanced around the cabin. A man, mid-40s, sharply dressed in a suit, sat across the aisle from him. His eyes locked onto Jamal's, and without a word, the man shifted in his seat, his posture rigid. Jamal quickly looked away, but the man's gaze didn't falter. Jamal felt it again, the subtle, uncomfortable tension of being the only black person on the flight. It started with a cough, a deliberate one. The man coughed twice, sharply, in Jamal's direction. The sound was heavy in the quiet cabin, almost mocking, and Jamal stiffened. His eyes met the man's once again. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low but firm. "You're crowding the armrest." Jamal blinked, thrown off guard by the sudden confrontation. His hand wasn't even near the armrest, but the accusation was clear. The tone was cold, dismissive. Jamal opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the man reached over and knocked his hand away. A sharp slap of his palm against Jamal's arm. It wasn't hard, but it wasn't gentle either. It was the kind of slap that came with an underlying message. A message Jamal had received all his life. "You don't belong here." Jamal froze, his hand still hovering midair. The entire cabin seemed to fall silent. The flight attendant, who had been walking down the aisle, paused and glanced over, but she quickly looked away. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the event had never happened, swallowed up by the hum of the engines. For a moment, Jamal couldn't breathe. The sting of the slap was nothing compared to the sudden rush of anger and confusion that surged within him. He wanted to yell, to fight back, but something held him back. Something deep inside him told him that speaking up would only make things worse, that it wasn't worth the trouble. The man leaned back in his seat, staring straight ahead, acting as if nothing had occurred. Jamal's hands trembled, and he clenched his fists, trying to steady his breath. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but this time, something was different. The anger was sharper, more pronounced, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this small act of cruelty, had somehow broken something inside of him. As the flight continued, Jamal sat in silence, staring out of the window, the weight of the man's slap still fresh on his skin. His mind raced, replaying the moment over and over. The fear of speaking up, the shame, the sense of being small in a world that seemed intent on reminding him of his place. Just when he thought he could sink into the abyss of his thoughts, a voice broke through. "Hey, are you okay?" It was a voice from the seat next to him, a stranger. Jamal turned to find a woman, her face gentle and kind. She was about his age, perhaps a little older, with warm eyes that held no judgment. She was the kind of person Jamal rarely encountered, someone who wasn't afraid to speak up, to reach out. She had been sitting a few rows behind him, but something about the tension in the cabin had caught her attention. She had witnessed the slap and the brief exchange. Without hesitation, she leaned forward and spoke. "That was wrong," she said softly. "You didn't deserve that." Jamal blinked, his heart racing. For a moment, he couldn't find the words. He had spent so long internalizing the racism around him, so long hiding his emotions, that hearing someone else acknowledge his pain felt foreign. He nodded, his throat tight. "I don't know what to do," he said, barely above a whisper. I don't know if it's worth it." The woman smiled, a soft but firm smile. "It's worth it," she said. "You deserve to be treated with respect. And you don't have to let this go." Jamal's eyes widened. He had never heard those words spoken to him like that before. The weight of the injustice he had faced, the constant feeling of being silenced, suddenly felt lighter. The woman's words pierced through the layers of fear and self-doubt that had kept him silent for so long. "You're not alone in this," she continued. "I won't let this slide. We can speak up together." What happened next was something Jamal hadn't expected. The woman stood up, walked down the aisle, and stopped in front of the man who had slapped him. Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable firmness in it. "Excuse me," she said, "but what you did back there was unacceptable." The man's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice laced with irritation. "You slapped him. And that's not okay," she said, her tone unwavering. "You owe him an apology." The entire cabin had fallen silent again, but this time, there was a shift. Heads turned, eyes focused. The man stammered, but the stranger didn't back down. For the first time, Jamal felt a surge of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Someone had stood up for him. Someone had taken action when everyone else stayed silent. The man sat in stunned silence, his face reddening with anger and humiliation. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. Jamal could see it in the man's eyes, the sudden realization that he had been caught, his actions exposed under the harsh and forgiving gaze of others. The cabin was still, all eyes trained on him. The woman's words lingered in the air, a challenge that had forced the man to face the consequences of his actions. "Apologize," the woman said again, her voice steady, yet unwavering. "It's the right thing to do." For a long moment, the man's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for an ally, but the silence that met him only deepened his discomfort. Slowly, his shoulders slumped, and with a heavy sigh, he muttered the words Jamal had longed to hear, "I'm sorry." It wasn't much, a half-hearted apology laced with reluctance. But for Jamal, it was more than he could have hoped for. His chest tightened with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He had never been in a situation like this before, where the oppressor was forced to acknowledge his wrongdoing. It felt like a small victory, a moment where the silence around racism had been shattered by someone willing to speak out. The woman turned to Jamal, her gaze softening. "You okay?" she asked, her voice warm. Jamal nodded slowly, the tightness in his chest easing. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. I didn't think anyone would ever step in like that," Jamal said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been putting up with this kind of stuff my whole life. I didn't know how to respond. It's like, you just get used to it, you know." The woman smiled gently. "You don't have to get used to it," she replied. "You deserve better than that. Everyone does." Jamal looked out the window again, the clouds swirling beneath them, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something that had eluded him for years: a hope. Maybe things could be different. Maybe change was possible, even if it was just one small action at a time. Scene 6, the journey of healing. Rest of the flight passed in a blur. Jamal's mind was spinning, processing everything that had just happened. The woman's words stayed with him, echoing in his thoughts. As the plane began its descent into New York, Jamal felt a mix of emotions: anger at what had happened, but also a sense of liberation that he had never felt before. The world didn't seem as dark, as oppressive as it had when he first boarded the flight, when the plane landed and the passengers started to disembark. The woman gave Jamal one last smile before disappearing into the crowd. He wanted to say something, thank her for everything, but the words seemed to get stuck in his throat. It was a fleeting moment, a small encounter in the grand scheme of things, but it had changed everything for Jamal. It had sparked something inside him, a fire that had been lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to ignite. As he walked down the jet bridge, Jamal's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his sister, checking in to see if he had arrived. He smiled at the message, but for the first time, it wasn't just about the excitement of seeing her. It was about something more, of a deep realization that his journey was only just beginning. The next few weeks were a whirlwind for Jamal. He spent time with his sister in New York, but his mind kept returning to the flight. The encounter with the man, the stranger's intervention, and the apology that had followed had left an indelible mark on him. He couldn't stop thinking about how the world had shifted, even in that small, confined space. Back at home, Jamal found himself thinking differently about racism. He had always known it existed, but he had internalized it for so long that it had become part of his life, a part he couldn't escape. The moment on the plane, though, had made him realize something powerful. He didn't have to accept it. He didn't have to live in fear or silence anymore. One evening, while scrolling through social media, Jamal came across a post about a local community organization that worked to combat racism. They were looking for volunteers to help with outreach programs and educational workshops. Jamal hesitated at first. He had always felt like an outsider in these spaces, unsure of how he could make a difference. But something inside him urged him to act. It was time to take a stand. He signed up. The first few weeks of volunteering were challenging. Jamal met people from all walks of life, and at times, he struggled with his own insecurities. But as he attended workshops, spoke to people, and shared his experiences, something incredible started to happen. He found his voice. One evening, during a community discussion, Jamal was asked to speak. The topic was about standing up against everyday racism, and as he stood in front of a room full of people, Jamal felt a mix of fear and excitement. But as he began to speak, his words flowed easily. He shared his story of the slap on the plane, the intervention of the stranger, the emotional journey he had undergone. "I never thought I could speak up," he said, his voice steady. "But I realized that silence only allows racism to keep going. We have to be brave enough to call it out, to speak for those who can't." The room was silent for a moment, and then a wave of applause swept over him. It wasn't just for what he had said, but for the courage he had shown. For the first time, Jamal felt like he truly belonged. He had found his purpose. Jamal continued his work with the community organization, and over time, he became a voice for others who felt silenced. He began to see how his experience on the plane, that one pivotal moment, had ignited something larger. It was no longer just about one flight, one incident. It was about taking action, about making sure the voices of marginalized people were heard. He still faced challenges, still encountered racism in its various forms. But now, Jamal faced it with a newfound strength, knowing that he wasn't alone. He had the support of his community, and more importantly, he had his own voice. The fight against racism wasn't over. But Jamal had learned that change didn't come all at once. It came in small, consistent acts of defiance. And with each act, with each word spoken, the world became a little bit better. Months later, Jamal found himself on another flight, this time with a sense of calm confidence. He smiled to himself as he settled into his seat, the familiar hum of the engines filling the air. As the plane took off, he looked out the window, knowing that the sky, vast and endless, held endless possibilities. He was no longer the person who had silently accepted racism, afraid to speak up. He was someone who had found his voice, who had learned the power of standing up, of making change, no matter how small. And as he flew through the clouds, Jamal knew that his journey, both in the air and in life, was only just beginning. Jamal's work with the community organization had become more than just a volunteer effort. It had become his mission. He was now deeply involved in organizing workshops, advocating for racial equality, and helping young people of color find their voice. Every day, he was learning more about the impact of microaggressions, the subtle and often unnoticed acts of racism that seeped into everyday life, and how deeply ingrained these biases were in society. One evening, as Jamal sat in a meeting with the organization's board members, an opportunity was presented. They had been offered a chance to speak at a major community rally, a gathering that would draw hundreds, if not thousands, of people. The focus of the rally was to highlight racial injustice and encourage people to take action. Jamal was asked to be one of the keynote speakers. At first, he was taken aback. This wasn't something he had ever imagined for himself, speaking in front of a large crowd, publicly addressing issues that had once made him feel so small and powerless. The thought of standing on a stage, speaking about his experiences, terrified him. But then, he thought about the slap on the plane. He thought about the stranger who had spoken up for him when no one else did. It was his turn now. He couldn't turn away from this opportunity. "I'll do it," Jamal said, his voice firm, though his heart raced. "I'm ready." The day of the rally arrived, and Jamal stood backstage, watching as people filed into the crowd. The energy was electric, but his nerves were undeniable. The smell of food vendors wafted through the air, children played in the distance, and activists set up their tables. But none of that reached Jamal's focus. His thoughts were consumed by the speech he was about to give. The organizers called his name, and the crowd erupted into applause. Jamal's heart pounded as he walked up to the stage. As he took the microphone, he saw faces in the crowd, young people, older individuals, families, and strangers. All of them had gathered for the same reason: to fight for justice, for equality, for a future where racism didn't hold them back. "Thank you," Jamal began, his voice shaky at first. "Thank you all for being here today. It's an honor to speak before you. But honestly, I wasn't sure I could stand here. You see, I've been living with racism my whole life. Every day, I've felt its weight. And for so long, I stayed silent. I didn't think my voice mattered. I didn't think speaking up would make a difference." He paused, the weight of his words settling in the air. "But I was wrong," he continued, more confident now. "The moment I started speaking up, the moment I started challenging those moments of hatred, that's when I realized something powerful. We can change things. We can make the world better. But only if we refuse to stay silent. We have to speak for the voiceless, stand for those who feel powerless." Jamal's heart swelled as he spoke, each word feeling more and more natural. This wasn't just a speech. This was a reflection of his journey. He was no longer the person he had been before, scared, quiet, and sure. He was now someone who had embraced his voice, his power, and was ready to share it with the world. "The fight against racism isn't easy," he added. "It isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, and it takes place in the spaces where no one is watching. But every time we stand up, every time we speak out, we take one more step toward justice. And together, we can make sure that no one has to live in silence, in fear, or in pain because of the color of their skin." The crowd's applause was thunderous. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. But now, it wasn't from fear. It was from exhilaration. For the first time, he had spoken from his heart, and the world had listened. After the rally, Jamal was overwhelmed by the response. People approached him with gratitude, sharing their own stories of struggle and survival. They thanked him for his words, for his courage, and for giving them hope. Jamal realized that his actions had sparked something in others, just as the stranger on the plane had sparked something in him. But it wasn't just the rally. Jamal's influence began to ripple through the community. He was invited to schools to talk to students about racial injustice and how they could advocate for themselves. He worked with local businesses to promote diversity and inclusivity. Slowly but surely, Jamal was becoming a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. His family noticed the change too. His sister, who had always admired Jamal's resilience, began to see him not just as her brother, but as a beacon of strength in their community. His parents, proud but never fully understanding the burden Jamal had carried, saw him in a new light. They had raised a son who not only survived but thrived, turning his pain into purpose. Scene 14, personal victory. One evening, as Jamal sat at his kitchen table, reflecting on everything that had happened, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the woman on the plane, the one who had stood up for him. "I just wanted to check in. I've been thinking about you," her message read. "I hope you're doing well. Keep using that voice of yours." Jamal smiled, a deep sense of gratitude washing over him. The woman had no idea how much her words had meant to him. She had been the spark that lit the fire of change within him. And now, he was spreading that fire to others. He typed back, "I'm doing more than well. I'm fighting for what's right. And I'll never stop." As Jamal continued to speak out, his voice grew louder, his influence stronger. The fight for racial justice was far from over, and Jamal knew that. But he also knew that he had made a difference, one person at a time. He had gone from a young man who was afraid to speak, to someone who had found his voice and was determined to use it for good.